Howdy, howdy, and welcome back to Gale FFTCG. I'm Serah, your host, and today we'll be asking the age-old question: has Verstael gotten any better? Verstael is an aggro list which plays multiple high-cost threats each turn, forcing our opponent to deal with them one after the other. For the uninitiated, Verstael is a 5 CP 5k ice forward that when it enters the field, you check the top 5 and add 3 characters of cost 5 or more into your hand. This is up 2, so even if you whiff, you're still probably going to add at minimum about 2. The list plays almost exclusively 5 costs, with anything else that's not a 5 cost being some sort of recursion engine or flicker package for Verstael. Versailles obviously gets better with the more high-costed cards that are released, meaning that there's almost always a chance that there will be some sort of new tool for Versailles to make use of. Versailles has quite a few discard outlets. In the 5-cost plus category, we have Laswell, which discards on entry, and also can be a bit of spot removal. When a fire or ice forward you control attacks, you choose one forward opponent controls, and you deal it 3k. So if this sticks around early, or you have a uncontested board state, your opponent's probably going to feel their smaller threats get hammered, basically. This card is very good, especially because we also aren't running many backups. Having the option to pitch this card for Fire or Ice is also notable. We have Orphan, 5 CP EX Burst, and it's an 8k, so it's a fairly beefy body. EX Burst, when your opponent discards one or more cards due to your summons or abilities, you choose a forward opponent controls and dull it. And at the beginning of the attack phase during each of your turns, your opponent discards one card. So this is just recurable discard. If you play this very early, your opponent is probably going to have to either remove it or suffer the consequences of letting it stick around for more than a turn. We also have Griever, which is one of the new includes from Opus 21. Griever is a 6 CP 9k that when it's put from the field into the break zone, you can search for a job witch and play it onto the field. You can also tap Griever and select one of the following actions. You choose one forward opponent controls and you can break it, or your opponent discards a card. This is just recurable discard again, or if our opponent is also an aggressive deck, we can force them to either not attack, or if they do attack, we have to basically make them choose what they want to keep around. Griever is a card that does require some haste, so playing this early is better than playing it late when your opponent likely has an answer to it. We have Theodore, which has Warp 2. If an opponent has 2 or less cards in their hand, Theodore gets plus 2k power, haste, and first strike. And when Theodore enters the field, your opponent discards 2 cards, and if Theodore enters the field from Warp, your opponent discards 1 card. If you play this very early, you can go ahead and have your opponent playing all their cards from their hand as soon as possible so that they get the most value, but then at that point Theodore comes down and is a big beater, and you can really force your opponent to play suboptimally by just threatening a Theodore on turn 1. We also have 7 CP Sephiroth. When Sephiroth enters the field, your opponent discards 2 from his or her hand, and when Sephiroth attacks, if your opponent has no cards in hand, you choose a forward opponent controls and dull and freeze it. Sephiroth also has a special that where you discard a copy of it and pay 1 ice, where your opponent discards 2 cards from his or her hand, and you can only use that during a main phase. The amount of discard that we have means that our opponent's really going to have to work very hard to keep up in resources over us. Not only do we have Verstael for card advantage, we also have some other pieces that can search us other cards or act as secondary card advantage to Verstael. We obviously have Verstael for searching up an ice forward. If we see this in our opening hand, we can search for Verstael straight away, and that will set us up for a pretty good position. Most everything in here is odd costed, so having one backup means that you're going to be able to discard things from hand and pay that odd CP, meaning you're never going to have to overpay. We also have Nail. This is a very old card, but still holds up just fine in a list like this. When it enters, you reveal top 3 cards. You can add up to 2 forwards among them and put the rest in the break zone. So it's just extra card advantage in this list. A card still hasn't come along that behaves in the same way as Verstael, quite like Nail. So until that day does come, Nail is still going to be an auto-include in this deck. We also have 5 CP Shinryu, who is a legend from Opus 20, with Brave, and when it enters the field, we can also search for 1 card and add it to our hand. This is insanely good. Being able to search any card is genuinely quite good, but it's also amazing considering we're in quite an aggressive meta at the moment. If your opponent controls 3 or more forwards more than you do, so say your opponent is on the play, they play some Final Fantasy 13 deck and just spew a bunch of forwards onto the field, the cost required to cast Shinryu is reduced by 3, making it a 2 CP search for any card you want. A 2 CP 9k is very strong, no need to tell you that. But this is also a 5 cost, meaning that Verstael can get it very early if you get a Verstael down. The other notable thing about this is that the deck has previously relied on board wipes such as Susano and other kind of enters the battlefield, does a thing. However, Shinryu has a special that is 6 CP and break all forwards opponent controls. You can only use this during your turn, but oftentimes if your opponent gets really aggressive, you play Shinryu, turn 1, you go ahead and get some sort of, or like turn 2, you go ahead and you get your board wipe and you just threaten this against your opponent. You have bigger blockers. You're able to play basically board wipe on the turn that it comes in potentially. This is good at pretty much any point in the game. Being able to search up copies of itself can be a really good way of just deterring your opponent, or you can just straight up board wipe. It is a very viable option to just straight up board wipe your opponent. And last but certainly not least, Meath. When Meath enters the field, you discard a card. If you do, search for 1 forward of the same cost as the discarded card and add it into your hand. Most things in this deck are 5 cost, so if you have a Shinryu in your hand and for some reason you don't feel like you want to play that card, I don't know why you wouldn't, but just for the talking's sake, you could pitch Shinryu and go ahead and search for Verstael, and Meath's a backup that is on the field, so Verstael can be paid for 4 and the 1 backup. Pretty good stuff. Now, we don't actually have a lot of Dull and Freeze, mostly because the big power of our forwards are the thing that we have to worry about the most. But we do have 2 of them. We have Ultimisia, who is the 1 witch in our deck that can be played off of Griever. When Ultimisia enters the field, we remove 5 characters of cost 5 or more in our break zone from the game. Not a problem. And when you remove 1 or more cards, you choose the same number of characters as the cards you removed this way. You dull and freeze them. Your opponent discards a card. So if our opponent kills Griever, we just make things worse by playing Ultimisia on the field and potentially dulling and freezing our opponent's backups very early on in the game. Ultimisia also has that lovely line of text that says it can't be chosen by your opponent's summons, so instant speed interaction is very difficult to deal with when it comes to this card. If your opponent, tries to cast, a fight spell or something on it, it just can never be chosen. This is really great. I don't need to tell you much more than that. Opus 21 was very kind to Ice, and Griever and Ultimisia just make a fantastic combo. We also have Fissilis. It's a 5 CP 9k. When Fissilis enters the battlefield or attacks, if your opponent has 3 cards or less in their hand, choose one of the following 1 of 2 actions. if your opponent has no cards in hand, select up to 2 of those actions instead. You can choose a character, dull and freeze it, or draw a card. And the last, but certainly not least part of this card is a special called Premium Fistless Bullet, which I just think is very funny. Pitch a copy, pay 2 ice, choose a forward, deal it 10k damage, and that forward's controller discards 1 card from his or her hand. So, what's really interesting about Fistless is obviously this does the ice thing of dulling and freezing a character. That can be anything. But being able to draw a card is super effective, especially when your opponent is forced to play poorly quite early. This is great with any number of our discard outlets. It's a super strong card, and being able to draw a card every turn is fantastic. Getting to do both is even better. Fistless is a fantastic card, one of my favorite cards in the game as it currently stands. We do have some removal as well. There isn't a lot of need for removal because we're playing so many big, dense threats. However, Opus 20 was very kind to us in giving us the Demon. And also, Opus 17 gave us this gem of a rare, the backup Tifa, which I'll get into in a moment. But first, the Demon. When Demon enters the field or attacks, you select one of the 3 following actions. Choose 1 forward, remove all cards in your opponent's break zone from the game, and deal it 1k for each card removed by this effect. Name 1 element, deal 7k damage to all forwards of the named element. That includes yours, it's worth noting. Name 1 job, deal 8k damage to all forwards with the named job. So, this is a multi-use board wipe that can deal with our opponent's break zone in elements that don't have a lot of break zone hate. We can deal with some of the more problematic mono decks. We can deal with some of the more problematic job-based decks. All of these are really important things to deal with that Demon just kind of does for being on the field for a turn too long, or just even coming onto the field at a really inopportune time for our opponents. It's just a great card, and it definitely improved Verstael by a significant margin. And last but certainly not least, we have Tifa. We love Tifa. 6 CP EX Burst. There are 3 copies in this list, and you might be thinking, why, Serah? Why would you even run this card? It seems a little bit for what it does. But having an EX Burst that deals 9k is nothing to sneeze at, especially in an aggressive meta. And the fact that it's a backup that Verstael can hit is very strong. And also, potentially the best part, I have stolen games, and it's hilarious to see the look on people's faces. You use 2 fire, and you can make Tifa an 8k forward. So, if you have used Tifa to remove something by just playing it on the field, that feels great already. The next turn, maybe you've cleared your opponent's board, and they're like, yes, 1 damage down. You're like, no, sorry, I have Tifa in the back row, and you swing out and you win. Super cool card. It's one of my favorites that has really kind of buffed Verstael significantly. Up next, we have our recursion and kind of card advantage packages, if you will. We have Celtius. This is not a new card by any stretch, but it is still just as relevant as the day it was printed. When Celtius enters the field, you can remove up to 5 fire forwards and or ice forwards in your break zone from the game. Then reveal top 5. You can play a forward of cost equal to or less than the number of removed cards from among them on the field and put the rest on the bottom. Basically, remove 5, play something of cost 5. Most everything in this deck is cost 5. You're going to be getting a better threat off of this. And especially because most of the time we're just discarding a lot of things from hand. We're hardly ever playing from backups. Your bin is going to be full and let Celtius go a little bit nuts. We're running 1 copy of 6 CP Idolus that when it enters the field, we choose 1 fire forward of cost 4 or less in your break zone, play it onto the field. This can only hit Celtius, but having multiple ways of getting Celtius onto the field, not just playing it, is super powerful. So we want to make sure that we can maybe do that. Again, it's hittable off Verstael, otherwise I wouldn't be running it. And just as a little icing on the cake, you can tap and crack Adultus and choose a forward and deal it 7k, so it's also a bit of removal. And we also have Renoa to flicker our Verstael. You can play Verstael on turn 1, go ahead and get those 3 back, and if you have Renoa in your hand, you just play it, go ahead and get another 3, you're already up in cards, and potentially can play out 3 forwards on turn 1, and your opponent's kind of like, oh no, unless they have an immediate board wipe. We don't have a lot in the way of protection, but we do have Amaterasu and Fail Thanos. Old versions of this deck either ran 1 or 2 Amaterasu, sometimes not even wanting to run that. However, we're living in a very aggro meta. We need to be able to counter our opponent's stuff, and sometimes living is better than losing. So, 3 copies of Amaterasu right now, and 1 copy of 5 CP Fail Thanos, a heroic from Opus 21. When your opponent uses an EX burst, Fail Thanos deals your opponent 3 points of damage. This is wild because we're an aggressive deck, we want to go on the offense. If our opponent hits a well-timed EX burst, we're in trouble. It could potentially stop our game plan hardcore, but if Fail Thanos says, hey, do you want to activate that EX burst? I'm going to deal you a bunch of damage. This can just potentially win us the game with how aggressive we are. When Fail Thanos is put from the field to the break zone, you choose up to 2 forwards and deal them 9k. So even if they want to remove it, you're still going to almost always force remove out of their hand and still kill 2 of their things. This card is wildly dangerous. Do not underestimate it. It's 5 CP, so Verstael can hit it. Super strong card, super great. We don't need it at any more than 1 because Verstael will likely get us there pretty quickly, but it's still just a great card in general. That is the end of the video. Don't forget to like the video, comment your thoughts on the deck, or subscribe to help the channel grow. The deck list is in the description. Have a great day and a great rest of your week.